Dear viewers and listeners, welcome again in the second video of this channel. Today we will open up a second section of topics, which will be about internal emotional wounds, or let's say wounds to the soul. I've included this topic in my series because for some time now I've been observing such internal emotional wounds in people more and more, and that's why I started to look deeper into this topic. And today's video will be the result of my several years of observation. I've also noticed that modern psychology pays almost no attention to this theory, even despite the fact that if such wound is strong, it completely controls a person's life and practically makes our lives into a living hell, as it causes constant recurring painful feelings from which there is no escape. That's why I thought I would try to draw a little more attention to these psychological issues. So let's look at those internal emotional wounds, let's show how they manifest themselves, how they affect our lives, and how to work with them. The theory of wounds was created by therapist and writer Lise Bourbeau. This is the book that forms the basis for today's episode. According to the author Lise Bourbeau, there are 5 basic types of wounds: rejection, abandonment, humiliation, betrayal, and injustice. These are obviously very basic human feelings. I would say these are feelings at the deepest level, which is why we are talking about wounds to the soul. Because try to imagine what could be more painful than to feel abandoned, rejected, humiliated, betrayed, or disrespected. I believe that in the most difficult mental conditions, a person is very likely experiencing one or a combination of these 5 strong feelings. And it's precisely these strong feelings that people experience. They constantly return to their lives, day after day, and there is no escaping them. The wounds we are talking about today are a certain predisposition in a person to experience a certain specific emotion along with them. This is usually activated in a person by a parent in childhood, and then the individual carries a wound like this into other phases of life. And before we start analyzing the wounds, let's clarify why we should pay attention to this concept and not include it all under concept of trauma, which by the way I will analyze in the next episode. After about 2 years of my observation, I've come to understand several important differences that fundamentally determine how successfully these strong feelings can be correctly diagnosed and treated. So let's talk about the basic criteria for such emotional wounds. Wounds are something like a person's inner predisposition, part of DNA of our spiritual essence. Unlike trauma, we are not as interested in the event that causes it. The objective cause of a wound often can be traced, as the soul attracts it in the early stages of physical existence in this world, when memory has not yet developed. The severity of the wound and its serious manifestations often don't correspond to the severity of the objective event that caused it. The wound appears to have deeper roots. Our physical body usually develops along with the wound, and this corresponds to the given type of wound, which is not generally observed in trauma. For example, a person whose soul is burdened by the wound of humiliation is usually stocky. A person suffering from the wound of rejection has a slim, narrow figure, so that he or she does not take up so much space in society. Or, for example, with a person suffering from the wound of abandonment, we see his pain in his or her eyes, big, sad eyes that draw attention to themselves and reveal the wound that's behind them. Trauma can also have effects on the physical body, but it doesn't define a person's appearance in such a complex and fundamental way. Wounds are often passed down from generation to generation. A wound is not just a burden on the soul of the individual, but of an entire family's lineage. So the unresolved wound of one generation is likely to be carried on for generations to come. This fact significantly changes the approach to the wound, as opposed to trauma. All these differences are important indicators that we should approach the wounds in a different way. Now we will explain the two most important terms in the theory of wounds: the wound itself and the mask. To explain, we will use the analogy of a physical wound, because it behaves very similarly to an emotional one. Let's say we have a deep wound on our hand. The wound hurts and it's unpleasant to live with. So we cover the wound with a band-aid, and we can keep it out of sight and hide it from others, because a physical wound makes us vulnerable in that place. Such a band-aid almost fulfills its role, but the wound still exists underneath it, and whenever someone touches that area, the wound starts to hurt again. And if we do not heal such a wound properly, it will hurt more and more under the bandage, because we have only covered it with a band-aid, but haven't healed it properly. Emotional wounds on the spiritual body behave in the same way. Emotional wounds are located deep within our souls, and just as we cover up physical wounds with bandage, we cover up our emotional wounds with a certain personality mask. The constructed mask provides certain abilities and learned reactive behavior that allow a person to hide the wound from others and from himself. That's why such a mask is a classic example of personality aspect, whose purpose is to divert attention from what is hidden in the depths. Now let's look at the nature of all 5 types of wounds, where we will first show, for demonstration purposes only, how such a wound is activated, what happens in the wounded person after the activation of the wound, and how a person usually reacts to it. First, let's start with rejection. A person with a rejection wound considers the greatest pain to be the feeling of being rejected by others, as a memory of the pain of being rejected by a parent. Rejection is planted into the wounded individual by the parent of the same sex. Thus, the mask of wounded individuals is formed so they don't experience another feeling of rejection. The mask commands escape from situations that evoke such feelings. The escapist pattern of behavior is also unpleasant for those surrounding wounded people, as these individuals are afraid to show disapproval in any way and seems to be very sensitive to all remarks and comments directed at them. Often then, individuals with a rejection wound are often rejected simply because of their masked reaction. The next wound is abandonment. The abandoned person considers the greatest pain to be the loss of emotional connection, the departure of a loved one, loneliness, and lack of attention. This is usually evoked in the wounded person by the parent of the opposite sex. The wounded person usually develops a dependency type mask. Since the wounded person's greatest fear is the feeling of loneliness and abandonment, the dependency mask usually works to create a disproportionate and sometimes unbearable need to be in contact. This type of relationship is very challenging for those surrounding the dependent type person, and often leads to abandonment due to being overwhelmed by the wounded person, which is the very thing that this individual wanted to avoid with their dependent behavior. The third type of wound is humiliation. This wound is characterized by the pain of the humiliation that is experienced. With a humiliation wound, which is usually inflicted later in development than the 2 previously mentioned wounds, the wounded individual usually develops a masochistic mask. Masochism plays a role for the wounded one, in which they would rather hurt and humiliate themselves then let the humiliation come from those around them. Any form of humiliation from anyone else is incomparably worse pain for humiliated individuals than the humiliation and torment they cause to themselves. Since the mask for this type of humiliation is one's own humiliation, wounded people have less impact on their surroundings because they are hurting themselves. And they also put themselves in a masochistically inferior role in society and tend to please others to prevent creating any reason for them to be humiliated. The fourth wound is betrayal. Person with betrayal wound experiencing pain when he or she perceives that the other person has betrayed him or her, or has failed to meet his or her expectations. This wound is evoked in the physical world by the parent of the opposite sex, who failed to meet child expectations or betrayed trust. The typical mask for this wound is control. Controlling everything around them seems to ensure that they will avoid the feeling of betrayal. Control provides the wounded person with a possible head start in preparing for or avoiding a situation in which they might feel betrayed. This can be caused by commitments or promises being broken, or just by a lack of commitment to the task and shared work. The controlling mask behavior is very demanding for the people around it. They must always keep their promises, even the less significant ones. They must meet all expectations, so they don't put themselves into the role of betraying parent through projection. With the last type of wound, that is injustice. One painfully perceives feelings of injustice, unfairness, unappreciation, disacknowledgement, and disrespect. This wound is usually formed at the later stage and is activated by the parent of the same sex. Injustice is a deceptive but powerful wound that forces the wounded person to constantly seek justice for themselves, their surroundings, and society. The search for justice and the continually recurring feelings of being unappreciated, unacknowledged, and disrespected force the ego to respond accordingly. This reaction is to be rigid, that is, an attitude in which the wounded person doesn't seem to let the pain caused by the certain situations be seen. All of this is only possible when the wounded person disconnects from their feelings and sets up a mask that says, "This doesn't affect me. I don't feel anything. I am strong." But in reality, it hurts the person with the injustice wound more than anyone else, because people with this type of wound are very sensitive. We can note that the reactions and patterns of behavior and attitudes stemming from the personality mask are very different from who these people truly are. People with injustice wound try to give the impression of being insensitive. Inside, however, they are very sensitive. The betrayed person often comes across as dominant, strong, and determined, but in reality, they are just trying to protect themselves from feelings of betrayal. So the strength is thus driven by fear. The mask, then, like most significant personality aspects, is path away from one's nature, one's soul. Such a constructed personality mask also paradoxically causes the opposite effect to what it is supposed to serve. The abandoned person creates so much pressure on the continuity of the emotional connection with other people that it overwhelms them and they logically tend to leave to relieve that pressure. The rejected person often creates feelings of guilt or loss of a good mood in other people by his or her immature escape from painful situations. And rejected people are only rejected because of their masked reaction. All of these and other reasons can lead to the conclusion that this state, that is, neglected wounds and the undiscovered mask of behavior is not an optimal one. A person is simply not him or herself. Now let's move on to what the possible reactions are when experiencing the wounds. In a given situation, the first person to be blamed is usually the person who seems to have caused the pain through their behavior. In these cases, we use the term wound projection. The projection shifts a part of the pain and excessive pressure and throws it all at the other person in the form of anger, remorse, or in worse cases, various kinds of aggression. The pain of activating the wound is projected onto the person who finds him or herself in close proximity to the wounded person, and unintentionally and unconsciously has activated this wound through their behavior. This projection is naturally not a solution, and is certainly not healing the wound. On the contrary, with each projection of this kind, the wound becomes more complicated and harder to heal. It diverts attention from the location and cause of the problem, which lies purely in the wounded person. In order to treat a wound, we must first find out where it's located. We are referring to the wound in the context of the soul, because the wound is found very deep within us. The main reason why the wounds are so deep within us is the fact that they are formed from the very first moments of our existence in this world, often before personality and memory begin to develop. But we don't go back to heal our relationship with parents or to examine specific situation. We go back to the time of our childhood to see how we felt and whether we happen to still be carrying this feeling around with us in our lives. Conversely, what is later located in the personality layer are the masks that the ego creates to protect and hide the wound. So if we want to heal our wounds, it's necessary to go through the sophisticated and complex layers of the personality to where the wound is. Life itself will often take us there. I will list 2 examples. First, it's usually some kind of life crisis, such as pressure at work. A person with a rejection wound is exposed to the criticism and pressure at work. Usually, she would escape such an unpleasant situation, which would be a typical reactive behavior of her escapist personality mask. But in order to keep her job, she has to endure this unpleasant situation. But healing does not consist in just enduring the situation. Healing means being aware of what the situation opens up in us, where the deeply hidden accumulated pain comes from, and consciously experiencing it in acceptance. The second example is establishing a deep relationship with another person. If we establish a deep relationship with another person, the soul comes to life. But with it comes everything that has been accumulated in the soul, including the wounds. In a newly established relationship, the feelings of rejection that the other person in the relationship constantly activates comes out in full force. Healing in this situation means being aware that we have carried these feelings of rejection within us, even before establishing this relationship. And the other person only activates this predisposition in us through his conscious or unconscious behavior. So the person consciously works with the feelings of rejection in herself. She does not reject these feelings, does not suppress them, does not project them onto the other person. She begins to experience feelings of rejection in acceptance, and thus these feelings begin to disappear on their own. Unfortunately, an unpleasant but reliable indicator that points us towards the wound is internal emotional pain. Unfortunately, pain cannot be avoided in this process. We must recognize the wound, understand it, and above all, consciously experience all the emotions and feelings that the wound in its pure essence brings with it. Only by experiencing and realizing all that the wound contains, will the wound itself weaken, allowing it to begin to heal. We must give the wound attention and space. If we get to the phase where we gain an awareness of the wound, accepted its existence, and give it the space to manifest itself, the wound will no longer cause such strong, uncontrollable feelings and pain. Deep wounds are likely to cause some degree of sensitivity, even after successful healing. However, the important thing is that we will now be able to fully live with the wound. It will stop causing unbearable pain and will no longer dominate our lives with fear. In this context, we use the term integration, that is, an incorporation of the wound into our consciousness and into our overall physical and spiritual being. After watching the full video, you might be getting a better idea of how important internal wounds are as a topic. From a deeper spiritual perspective, there isn't a more important and challenging task in life ahead of a person suffering from a particular wound or a combination of different wounds than to discover and heal that wound. The wound keeps the person trapped, and there is no escape from it other than to stop avoiding the wound and facing it. I can hardly imagine a better definition of the word fate for a person suffering from a severe wound. The wound is the fate of the wounded person because it's hidden deep in the soul and it's impossible to escape it. So, if you are experiencing constantly recurring feelings of abandonment, rejection, humiliation, betrayal, or injustice, you can be certain that the only way to gain freedom from these feelings is to face them head on and consciously work with them. We will talk more about this in the practical part of second episode, which I will publish approximately in 2 months. So if you are interested in this topic, you can subscribe to this channel and wait for the release of the practical part of this topic. I would also like to invite you to view the next episode, where we will take a more detailed look at the wound of abandonment.